Stones. So pay attention to Janis Joplin, pay attention and take more notes on the Beatles, okay? Now we'll go back and talk about Janis Joplin. We told you that she was born in January of 1943 in Port Arthur, Texas. We told you she was a typical elementary student. She grew up in a town that was a clean, middle-class town. She had a very enjoyable experience in her elementary years. Her high school years were tough because she was treated poorly by classmates. She had some acne issues. She had what they considered an underdeveloped body. She did what most kids do that are a bit ostracized. She found a common group of friends that were similar to her, and maybe those kids were being ostracized as well. And she began to rebel against her hometown. Didn't particularly care for her hometown. I told you that she and her friends often traveled to nearby Louisiana, where they drank and listened to black music. She soon fell in love with the blues, sparked an interest in her becoming a musician. We mentioned that she graduated from high school in Port Arthur in 1960. Actually, I was going to throw this in, I don't know how many are football fans, but you ever heard of Jimmy Johnson, who coached the Dallas Cowboys, very good coach of the Dallas Cowboys? She actually graduated with him as a classmate. They were classmates together. She enrolled at Lamar Tech, and she left Lamar Tech and later enrolled in the art school at the University of Texas in Austin in 1962. Didn't really like that, so where did she go, Jalen? Do you remember? Where did she go after she quit college for the last time? She went to Haight-Ashbury. She joined that hippie scene in Haight-Ashbury. She performed what we call gigs at local coffee houses and bars, which are just little performances. She eventually met up a group of musicians, and they formed a group called Big Brother and the Holding Company. And we told you that that particular group became fairly famous. They played at such famous sites such as Madison Square Garden, also performed at Woodstock. And after touring and recording with the group for a period of time, she was the one that kind of stood out, became famous. She was adored by the media, and the band became a little more and more jealous of her as she became more and more popular. And it led to a rift in the group, and I think that's kind of where we left it, was that not? Yeah. Okay. Well, by the end of 1968, she, like many other groups that you'll find in the 60s, announced she was going to be leaving Big Brother and the Holding Company. And after all their contracted performances were fulfilled, in other words, they signed contracts that they, guaranteed performances together. Once those ended, she left the group. And by the time she left Big Brother and the Holding Company, she had become so popular and well listened to that she was making a six-figure salary at that time, which is $100,000 or more. Okay? So she was making a six-figure salary when she chose to depart from Big Brother and the Holding Company. Well, she made an appearance, and we'll give you an example of this today probably, on what was called the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, you guys are way too young to remember that. I'm almost too young to remember it, but I do remember that it was on Saturday night and my parents watched it, unless my dad was disgusted on who Ed Sullivan brought in to perform. And basically what the Ed Sullivan Show was, it was a very prestigious show that he would bring in new talent, whether it be a musician or a magician or an author or whatever. It was kind of like Jimmy Kimmel. It was kind of like Jay Leno, only it was a lot more performance than it was visiting. What's that? It was a talent show. Yeah. Now, the one that he brought in, and I'll show you this, and we'll get to that in a minute, the one big group he brought in 1964 were the Beatles, just when they were getting started. And we'll show you that. That was quite a thing when they went on the Ed Sullivan Show. But if you got on the Ed Sullivan Show, you were an up-and-coming or somebody. And after she left Big Brother and the Holding Company, she had made an appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. So what do you think she did after that? What did she do after she broke up from Big Brother and the Holding Company? Because they were jealous of her and she was getting all the attention. What do you think she did? Because if she does this, it doesn't matter if she's the center of attention. She forms what? Her own band. And it was called the Cosmic Blues Band. So Joplin leaves Big Brother and the Holding Company, making a six-figure salary, makes an appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, and then forms a new band she handpicked herself called the Cosmic Blues Band. And obviously she would pick people that knew their place, you know what I mean? That she was the star and they were the ones working for her. So she forms a new band called the Cosmic Blues Band, and it was a band that she handpicked herself. Well, that didn't work out real good, and so she had trouble leading this new band. They weren't very well received, especially in the San Francisco crowd. And a lot of people were mad at her for doing what? Well, before that, what? Leaving Big Brother and the holding company. So a lot of people thought she just used that as a stepping stone to get her career going. And actually people in that area supported the band members more than her. So she took some criticism in the San Francisco area when she put that new band together. Well, she started using drugs quite extensively. And she decided that she better try to get clean. So she disbanded the Cosmic Blues Band. And after getting herself clean, she started another new band called the Full Tilt Boogie Band. So the Cosmic Blues Band didn't last very long. Again, people in San Francisco area where she was based didn't take to that. They were still mad at her for leaving Big Brother and the holding company. Started getting herself involved in drugs. She could see she had a problem, so she decided to get clean. And when she got clean, she started a brand new band called the Full Tilt Boogie Band. Well, pretty successful band, and she really started working hard on recording an album. Now, this is something maybe some of you don't understand. What's an album? Now, are you, Sadri, into that kind of? Was that you that was into it? What's an album? It's a record. It's one of those big records. I mean, we went from 45s to albums that had all these songs on them, and then we went to 8-track tapes, and then we went to cassette tapes, and then we went to CDs or whatever. Now we got all this stuff. But in the old days, and people still do collect vinyl albums, okay, and they're the old records. And she put out an album that was entitled Pearl, which was very, very well received, Pearl. And that happened on October 4th, 1970. So on October 4th, 1970, after recording an album entitled Pearl, Joplin and her new band were in Los Angeles performing hits off of that album. Okay, so on October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin and her new band were in Los Angeles. They were touring and performing hits off the album Pearl. Well, that night of October 4th, the band partied until the early morning hours, and then returned to their hotel room. So they recorded, performed the night of October 4th. They partied until early morning hours. They returned to their whole hotel room. And at her hotel room in Los Angeles, it was called the Landmark Motor Hotel, if you care, she decided to mix a batch of heroin that had been delivered to her the day before. Okay, so after performing the night of October 4th, the band partied until early the morning hours of October 5th. She got back to her motel room at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Los Angeles, and she decided to mix a batch of heroin that had been delivered to her from a dealer the day before. Okay? Well, I don't know a lot about heroin, although it's getting to be quite the comeback here at our, especially in this area. But you got to be careful with heroin because you can't mix heroin too pure. You got to kind of dilute it. Well, she got a batch that was too pure, took the heroin, and died of a heroin overdose early in the morning of October 5th, 1970. So the heroin that was sold to her and delivered the day before her death was considered too pure. And after taking a batch of heroin, injecting that into her veins, she died of a heroin overdose that morning. She was just 27 years old at the time of her death. 27 years old. She was cremated and her ashes were scattered off the California coast. So Janis Joplin, who died of a heroin overdose, was cremated, and her ashes were scattered off the California coast. Now, since her death, rock and roll historians have described Janis Joplin with these 7 expressions. This is how they, one-word expressions on how to describe Janis Joplin. Rock and roll historians will give us 7 expressions, on just one-word expressions on explaining Janis Joplin. Anybody want to throw any out for fun? One-word expression?
What?
Close. What? I think somebody said it. What? What? Did you say something, Braden?
No.
Wait, what'd you say?
Dead.
Dead. Well, that's true, but not. Okay. Bold. She was bold. And she was bold. Swaggering. Cursing. She swore like a sailor. Druggin, not drugging, druggin. D-R-U-G-G-I-N, druggin. She was drugging. Drinking. Rebellious. And liberated. Those were the 7 expressions that rock and roll historians use to describe Janis Joplin. Quite a legend in the rock and roll scene. Even though it was a long time ago, her music is pretty well listened to today. Had a very raspy, masculine voice. If you get a chance, you might want to get on iTunes and check something out. Okay, we'll talk about Jimi Hendrix next. How many people have heard of Jimi Hendrix? Okay, what do you know about Jimi Hendrix? I said, tell me one thing about Jimi Hendrix you've heard. What would it be? Anybody? Okay. Well, he's very famous. He was known as a great guitarist in the 1960s. And he actually was born Johnny Hendrix. He was born in 1942 in Seattle, Washington. And again, we're going to go through this and you pick up kind of what you think is important, but don't concentrate on everything. Okay? Jimi Hendrix had a very difficult childhood. Sometimes living in the care of relatives. He even had to live with acquaintances at times. He did not have a very good upbringing. His parents were not a solid parental unit, so to speak. Spent a lot of time in care of relatives. He had to stay at acquaintances at times. Not a very good childhood. His mother was only 17 years old when he was born. And Jimmy's father, whose name was Al, they had a very stormy relationship. It never really amounted to any commitment at all. So his mother was only 17 when he was born. She had a very stormy relationship with Jimmy's father. His name was Al. They actually had 2 more children together, and Al just left the family. There was no commitment at all. So it was not a good situation at all from the parents' side. That's why he stayed with relatives and acquaintances most of the time, because his parents were very dysfunctional. To keep his mind off his poor childhood, he actually looked to music as a sanctuary, and he taught himself to play the guitar. So he turned to music as a sanctuary and taught himself to play the guitar. Well, he became incredibly inspired when he was 14 years old when he saw Elvis Presley perform for the first time. He became very inspired when he was just 14 when he saw Elvis Presley perform, and because of that influence, he got his first electric guitar the following year. So at 14 years old, he saw an Elvis Presley performance, became very inspired, and the following year was able to secure his own electric guitar, which he was most famous in playing. Well, school wasn't the thing for him. He dropped out of high school, worked a few odd jobs, continued to follow his musical aspirations, and then had nothing going. And what did kids do that dropped out of high school and didn't have much going? What? No? Well, that's a good guess. But he, actually this was productive. This has changed now because you have to have a diploma to do this now. What did he do? He did. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1961. He just didn't have anything going. And in those days, even when I was growing up in the 70s, if you dropped out of high school, you either went and got a job at the local standard station and worked there till you were 65, or you went into the service. That's what you did, because you didn't need. I remember guidance counselors when I was growing up would bring kids in and say, you know, Levi, you're just pitiful, man. You're never going to get out of here. Go join the Marines. I mean, that's what they did. I mean, they'd say, okay, and they'd go join the Marines. Or they'd bring you in and say, geez, you're not amounting to too much. You're never going to get out of here. Otto's hiring down at the standard station. I know he needs somebody down there to pump gas, because in the old days he used to come out and actually do that for you and clean your windows. Why don't you go down there? And the guy would go down there, and the next thing you know, he's 60 years old, and he's still working at Otto's standard station. That's how it worked in the old days. And so Hendricks decided he'd join the United States Army in 1961, and he was going to be trained to be a paratrooper. He was going to be trained to be a paratrooper.
1961?
1961, yeah. He joined the Army in 1961, and they trained him to become a paratrooper. Now, he actually continued with his music, and while he was in the service, he created a band called the King Casuals. So he continued his music interest in the 1960s in the service. And he actually formed a band while he was in the service called the King Casuals. Well, he got injured while serving in the United States Army, and because of that injury, he was discharged in 1962. Honorably discharged in 1962 because of an injury that he had occurred. And so he continued from 1962 through the middle part of 1966 trying to chase this musical dream, okay? But what do you need to make it big in music? You need something besides talent. What do you need? A break. You need a connection or a break. You need a break. And he got that break in mid-1966 when he met a guy by the name of Chaz Chandler. He met a guy by the name of Chaz Chandler in mid-1966. Now, Chaz Chandler was a very famous manager of a group called the Animals in the 1960s. I think I've got a sample of their music that we're going to listen to sometime today. The Animals. And he was a very successful manager of the Animals, who were a very popular group in the 60s. Now, what's the difference? I got to get this straight. What's the difference between the Animals, who you've never heard of, and the Beatles, who you've heard of all the time? What do you think the difference is? Because the Animals were very, very popular in when? The 1960s. These groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they continued to perform for decades. That's why you hear of them now. The Animals were very popular in the 60s, and they kind of fizzled out. It's the same thing. Justin Timberlake has kind of fizzled out. Hadn't he a little bit? I don't know. But I mean, everybody has their run for a period of years, then they're kind of done. These groups that you hear of, like the Rolling Stones and Beatles, they performed and were very popular in a couple different decades. That's why you hear about them. Now, Chandler liked Jimi Hendrix's music, and so he convinced him to go to London with him. And he wanted him to play with two other guys, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. So Chaz Chandler listens to Hendrix's music, and he likes it. And he convinces Jimi Hendrix to travel with him to London and to join forces with a guy by the name of Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. And they got together and played and were successful and created a band called the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So Chaz Chandler likes this guy. Hendrix gets his break in mid-1966. He convinces him to go to London and team up with a guy by the name of Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. They do very well and create a band called the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Now, what two famous groups were in London that listened to the Jimi Hendrix Experience and became big fans of him, which really launched his career? The Beatles and the Rolling Stones. So, when he performed, the Beatles took a liking to the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and so did the Rolling Stones, which certainly did not hurt them, because those two groups were rock royalty in London, in England. And in 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released their first album, or record. Okay? And it was entitled, Are You Experienced? In 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released their first album. That was a big deal to release an album. It'd be like releasing a CD today or whatever. I don't know. Things have changed so much. But they released their first album, 1967, entitled, Are You Experienced? And of course, what's the thing about an album that's important? The hit singles that come off an album. Just like you guys buy a CD, right? They're supposed to, well, you don't, everybody downloads now, don't they? But in the old days, you know, all these, if you look at these CDs, it'll say, including the hit singles, this and this. Well, the two hit singles for Hendrix in the Are You Experienced album were Hey Joe and Purple Haze. Hey Joe and Purple Haze. And this album went nuts. And Jimi Hendrix became an incredibly big rock superstar.